Greetings, everyone. My name is Sophie Cavoulacos. I'm a curator in the Department of Film at MoMA and one of the instructors for What is Contemporary Art, and welcome to our office hours. Great to see so many of you here. I'd also love to know in the chat if you're joining us for the first time or if you have been in one of our sessions before. This office hours series is meant to be an informal hour-long conversation to extend the discussions in the Coursera course. Please put your questions in the chat and make sure you select all panelists and attendees so we can all see your contributions. And we'll get to as many questions as we can in the next hour, as well as those that have been submitted in advance. Several MoMA colleagues are present today and they respond to the chat with resources and recapitulation summaries of what is being said. And I'd also like to thank Zach, Chris, and Mark from our audio visual department behind the scenes working to bring us to you so seamlessly.
And good day to all of you. My name is Sean Anderson. I'm Associate Curator in the Department of Architecture and Design. I'm so happy to be with all of you again and with Sophie. After several months, we recognize and understand that many of us are in various stages of lockdown, in various stages of quarantine, and so forth. So it's our great pleasure to be joining in with all of you in this conversation today. And thank you, those of you who are coming for the first time. These are office hours. These are informal conversations around artworks, ideas, questions that this course continues to provide. And so we're always grateful to our education team who help us put these hours together. Some housekeeping reminders because we're all in it together here before we get started. We are recording this session, and by staying in this session, you consent to our recording it. We will share it in week one, the readings and resources, with a summary of links in the coming days. You can turn on closed captioning at the bottom right of the Zoom window. Click on either closed captions and then view subtitles, or the three dots for more, then view subtitles. I always need these kinds of instructions as well, so thank you. You can also change your view from speaker to gallery view at any time. We're so excited that many of you, literally from around the world today. I don't think we've ever had guests from both Japan, Russia, and South America, and Europe, and of course the US.
From Colombia.
So we're very, very pleased. And we've received a few questions, a great series of questions. And I'm gonna let Sophie start us off today. As this is a kind of return to office hours, today we're going to keep it open and we're going to have a discussion about a new set of installations in the museum. Sophie,
yes,
take it away.
Sean. Thanks, Sean. Yes, so it's been a few months since we've done one of these sessions with What is Contemporary Art, and in that time there have been changes to the physical galleries in the museum, and so we thought we'd start by taking you there and showing you what we've been up to. Next slide. In just to give you a taste. So the Museum of Modern Art reopened just one year ago. It feels like an eternity ago, with reinstalled collection galleries from head to toe. Every collection gallery was reinstalled in an interdisciplinary and more international perspective. And part of that installation was actually a sentiment that I think is very dear to our hearts in the course, is that the narrative of how we present contemporary art would be open-ended and would be evolving, which means that in our first year, we committed to changing 1/3 of the displays. So we've now completely reinstalled 1/3 of the galleries, and we're giving you just just a taste of 2 galleries on the 2nd floor. And Sean and I just wanted to speak, each of us, just about 1 or 2 works that are meaningful to us in this display as a way to open up some ideas and questions. So we're here in the gallery that is titled The Sum of All Parts, that looks at various works in different mediums that are thinking about the body in relationship to society and politics. Even this idea of the body politic, actually, I think is a great term to think of individual and collective actions and existence. And I think if we can go to the next slide, Sean and I are good co-instructors because we gravitated twice towards works that are installed next to each other without talking to each other.
Without knowing.
So I'll let Sean, back to you, Sean, if we can go to the next slide to talk a little bit about South African artist Sue Williamson.
Absolutely. Thanks, Sophie. What's intriguing about what the museum is calling the fall reveal, as Sophie described, is that a set of galleries on every floor, every collection floor in the museum is being switched up, either for conservation purposes, but in many cases, the entire room has changed. The entire articulation of ideas, questions has been changed. So imagine, if you will, a room that was, in this case, a room of profoundly important women and sculpture and painting, as it was when we reopened the museum in October of 2019, now has shifted to think of, as Sophie described, the body politic. And I chose Sue Williamson's work. I've been very, very interested in her work for quite some time. She is a South African artist who works across mediums, although I would say that she's perhaps more well known for her photographic documentary kinds of projects and works, as it were. But this room, to me, when I first entered it, and I saw it changing over time, speaks to not only a kind of fragmentation of the body politic in the late 70s and early 80s up until the 90s, that this kind of fragmentation, if you will, and breaking up, but then a reordering of the body politic, not only the physical body, the conceptual body, but perhaps even a kind of theoretical body, an ideological body. And so I chose this work by Williamson in part because I felt that it speaks to some of the ideas that we have presented in previous office hours, namely around agency and the questions that agency brings up. Now, just to step back for a moment, when we speak of agency, we're talking about power. We're talking about the role of, or the roles of individuals, communities, to present an alternative, or to represent an alternative to the structures and systems in which they are located. And that agency comes out of not only physical and verbal responses, but the ways and means by which individuals and communities respond to power. So we could understand that power is an overarching, large concept. We all have to face it and negotiate it in our own ways throughout the world in various forms. It's not always about the government necessarily. And we've seen shifts in how agency is not only made visible in recent months with protests around the world, but then we could also offer the American elections most recently as one instance in which agency and democracy, hopefully, are intersecting with each other in a more visible way. So that's a very long kind of background to then present you Sue Williamson's work, which was produced 4 years prior to the end of apartheid. in South Africa. Apartheid, if we don't know, apartheid was the system, the government legally mandated system for the division of people. And as a recourse, many people, Black Africans, white Africans, South Africans, however we want to construct it, were very much delineated and dissipated across the country of South Africa. In particular, urban spaces like Johannesburg and Cape Town, the two primary cities of South Africa, were designed and defined through systems of apartheid. These included passbooks that are now seen. Thank you for switching the slide. Passbooks were to be held primarily by Black individuals as a means to be able to circulate through the city. So these were in Johannesburg and Cape Town, for instance, mainly, the passbook was a means by which an individual had to show not only where they are from, but who they are with this image, with a photographic image, much like we might say a passport today. In the case of passbooks, though, these were legacies of colonial measures as well. So if we were to look at other colonial contexts on the African continent, the passbook or a permission or some kind of ID often was used to determine who could enter which space. So this work is the documentation of one individual across 40 different panels. And these 40 different panels show different pages of his passbook. And the passbook then becomes the kind of receiver of these stamps that shows that he could move across these boundaries, invisible, invented, defined in very particular ways. And so each of the panels like this one, and I think there's one more slide, perhaps. Thank you. You can see the stamps here that indicate that not only was he allowed to leave a particular space, but then re-enter another space. This was very common practice in the years of apartheid. And quite often, if you did not have your passbook, or if your passbook was deemed not, say, clean enough, or whatever reason, the individual quite often would not be allowed to enter into these spaces. So what we're seeing here is not only a work of documentation, but also speaking to the role of bureaucracy, the role of an invented kind of government imposition on individuals and individual bodies. But something that we've spoken about in previous office hours has been the role of borders and the definition of borders as being not only created, inscribed in the landscape, but also inscribed onto our bodies and into the space of bureaucracy. So what I appreciate about this work, and could we go back to the slide of the whole of the work, please? Super, thank you. Just to give you a sense. So what we're looking at then is not only this kind of story, if you will, or narrative of of this individual's moving across these boundaries, but we're also seeing the role in which a racist, dominant culture and institution has been placed on an individual's body and the occupation of the spaces that he is allowed to enter or to exit, as it were. So I think in a way, this work speaks to not only how individuals and communities in South Africa were very much under this almost totalitarian kind of control of bodies, and incredibly violent as well. We can't discount that. But that the movement of individuals and the transits of individuals today is very much akin to what we're seeing in this case, with the role of international travel bans, of borders, and in fact, I would say, to some degree, even what COVID and the pandemic has brought to us around the world is a recognition of where we can and can't go, even though people are trying to, forget about these rules. What does it mean to move today? And what does it mean to have an object or a tool or oneself that is, on one hand, able to move through the internet, through Zoom even, and then at the same time being told, in fact, no, you cannot move. And so for Sophie, I leave that to you.
I was just gonna, no, thanks, John, so much for that. What I was just gonna say is to think of the passbook as something that you would hold in your hand that we're now seeing taking up space, like thinking of who's allowed to take up space, and that the work is in some ways rectifying that limitation on the body. And what's actually, I love how in sync we are, even without talking, because my piece is also the piece I'm talking about is also about the use of books and book pages. If we can go to the next slide, past the details, and then back to, here we go. So this work, which is neighboring this Williamson work, is a large-scale watercolor, charcoal, and pencil work that integrates pages of a book. So it's large scale, 69 by 14, and in the center has what appears to be a kind of triangular ladder from which sprawling animals and horns and kind of symbolic movements and objects are departing from. And this piece was made by a collective, actually, or a collective group known as Tim Rollins and KOS, Kids of Survival. That was a group of actually students, middle school age students that Tim Rollins, who's an artist and educator, taught in the South Bronx. And it's surprising, I think, and really meaningful to think of kind of art education as relates to art creation and art practice, meaning Tim Rollins is somebody who taught, again, kind of teenage boys and girls too, but I think this was primarily a group of young men. And those conversations and those interactions became not peripheral to his work as a painter or an artist or creator, but actually front and center. So they, in this group, very often looked at works of literature or works that are canonical in a kind of curriculum of how young people and adults as well, of course, come to understand the world around them. Like, right, what are the classics? What are the important works? What are the ways in which you compare yourself to creators and societies and civilizations past and present? So this piece took a starting point, actually an unfinished novella by Franz Kafka called America that outlined the trials of an immigrant from Germany in the US in the beginning of the 20th century. And Rollins and KOS literally are dissecting this book, meaning they're using its book pages as material in this kind of actually fresco or mural-like work that is part of a much larger group of pieces inspired by America that is kind of casting these symbolic tableaus of what it means to be an American in American society, what might be our path, our individual paths and our collective paths in this pivotal time that was the 80s, meaning kind of social upheaval, political upheaval, but also certainly the AIDS crisis and other kinds of crises, the culture wars, descending and ascending on New York City, among other places. So the two things that really strike me about this work, and I really love to see it and to think about it, is, and this is what this hour and this course is about too, how do you see yourself in a work of art? You know, the idea that high school or middle school kids from the South Bronx were reading Kafka and not saying, I have to understand it in a certain way, but I'm going to use it as a material for it to be useful in my life, and to find meaning in it that's personal and creative. That's really special for me to think about. And also the collective creation. And this is something that KOS operated in for years and years. And that legacy is so important of thinking, and I think about this at the museum and what we're doing here again, the educational mission and the educational perspective as one that is not separated from a fine art or a critical perspective, that those are so intertwined. So I would encourage, I think that there was a beautiful exhibition of KOS and Tim Rollins actually at the University of Pennsylvania when I was a student there. Now I'm realizing that I have an extra resonance that I was a student when I saw this work about students being so integral to the creation of artwork. So two different takes on books, two different takes on kind of collective actions. This is one gallery, one of the many galleries you can see if you come and visit us at the museum. If we go to the next slide, we're going to go to something completely different, another gallery that is reinstalled. Next slide. Yes, thank you. Next slide. Now I'll turn it over to you, Sean.
Well, I would say that what I want to do is actually respond to the KOS, because one of our learners has said that in fact the collective still exists and it has ongoing members and so forth. And I wanted to also mention this idea of kind of a collectivity, right? That the body politic as we began today is on one hand about the individual, like we've seen in Williamson's work, and then also the fact that Rollins and KOS created that work as a group, right? That there's an integration, if you will, between the individual and a collective and the group at large. And I think so much of what we are seeing now, even earlier, we see from the 1960s and 70s different forms of collectivity, different forms of individuals coming together. And what I appreciate about that work in particular is that it is not the singular artist, right? That it is actually a group of artists. Some are quite young, obviously, but that we have to be aware that when we name artists and when we articulate the role of artists, that there are others often involved. And when,
But I was guilty of that myself because I said that in the past tense because Rollins has passed away.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry.
No. It's true that KOS is very, very much still active. And yes, that's the thing with contemporary art. It's still here. It's not the past. So.
Exactly. But it's about production, right? It's something about, I remember in one of our first office hours, someone asked, what is contemporary? Mm-hmm. And I think we all had a different view, and some suggested it was about time, some suggested it was about a kind of, say, a fissure in society that then we step into a contemporary. And then we could also think that the contemporary is just always now, always happening, always building on each other. But those two works, when they're next to each other, it reminded me very much of a kind of building, right? That they're not static in as much as because as you described, the ground, if you will, of the Tim Rollins work is a series of pages from the book America, spelled with a K. And so it's the painting and the drawing is on top of the narrative. It's on top of the book, as it were, in as much as the stamps in Sue Williamson's depiction of the passbook are on top of the book. So there's a kind of, what I would say, an inscription of meaning or an inscription of power through the replication of those pages, but also the replication of the marks on those pages.
Yeah,
And what I, go ahead, sorry.
No, definitely. And yeah, again, making power and making voice visible, basically, you know,
Yeah,
who gets
exactly.
voice, who gets to read Kafka and say, it's not about Kafka, it's about me. You know, I think that's really beautiful, actually. I'm seeing some things in the chat, certainly about kind of the political climate that we find ourselves in the United States, forms of activism, and ways of, I think, even just processing. And that maybe is a really nice dovetail into this gallery and into Sibyl's work that you're about to tell us about.
Yeah. So, I mean, what I would say is that you move from the gallery that we were just in looking at, the kind of fragmentation of the body and the body politic, into a room that's a very provocative room of sculpture, predominantly with artists by with works by David Hammonds, Katie Noland, and Jimmy Durham. And then we walk into this space, which in a way begins a different set of narratives, although connected to what was present in the previous collection hang, in that we, those of us who were working on the second floor, both Sophie and I were working on the second floor in various capacities, is to look at 1989 as a shift, not only in terms of society around the world, China, East Europe, etc., but what does 1989 start to connote in terms of our own histories, our own ways of imaging ourselves, and imagining the spaces in which we are, or some were living in at the time. So 1989, like you just said, Sophie, is about seeing ourselves. I think seeing ourselves through a different lens. In this case, we have four works in a way, but I'll just describe them. On the left is a painting of a watchtower by the artist Sigmar Polke. On the right is a series of photographs by the photographer Michael Schmidt. In the corner is a work by as a standing figure, which Sophie will talk about in a moment, by the artist Martin Kippenberger. And then in the foreground is a vitrine in which there are a beautiful set of ephemera from our archives and our library, and artists as well, of pamphlets and other graphics from this moment in 1989, especially in the context of Eastern Europe. At the moment, though, is if we're thinking of this transition, how do we think of surveillance in the case of Polke? That we create these, we create structures to surveil people and communities, in as much as we see faces in Michael Schmidt's series of photographs, faces that are looking at us as the viewer. They are black and white. They are reminiscent of mugshots in certain cases, although they there's a kind of complexity to those images that is very, how should I say, intense almost. And then there is this standing figure staring into the corner by Kippenberger that Sophie will describe.
Go to the next slide. Next, you know what, Sean, I realized we have the wrong image. This is not Sibyl. Next slide.
Oops.
That's my bad. I don't know if you want to talk about this series.
Yeah.
Yeah.
let's go to Kippenberger then.
Okay,
No?
okay. Next slide.
There.
This is live television, so we're readjusting the program. I made these slides last night, but it's true. The way that Sean has framed the gallery, I think, goes into this work quite aptly, which is about again the structures. Oh, you're getting
New York.
a very nice Brooklyn siren right there. That was a great one. 1989, the idea of after the wall, the world is connected in new ways, and new possibilities are afforded, hopefully, for connection. But that also means consumption, and that also means the distribution of power and knowledge, and political power, certainly. And within this gallery, that's differently about resistance, about surveillance, about formation of history, actually, and how to deal with memorials and things like this. You have this figure of the artist, Martin Kippenberger, facing the corner. So the title of the artwork is Martin, Into the Corner, You Should Be Ashamed of Yourself, made in 1992. This work was created by German artist Martin Kippenberger, who was kind of known for his both artistic and frankly, personal excess and flamboyance, certainly. It was made after an article printed in German press, art press, reprimanding him for being this kind of enfant terrible, this kind of controversial figure in the art world. And it's both a work that is self-critical, but ironic and sardonic in a larger way, in brushing against the norms, right, of behavior. And what is acceptable. And I really, for anybody who's in New York City, I so encourage you to come in and visit our fall reveal, our reinstallation, because I'm actually just wanting to describe what it's like to encounter that work in the gallery. You enter the gallery, which is extremely vast, high ceiling, and against that backdrop, you see this kind of life-size figure of the artist. The work was made by actually both, I believe it was first a wood and then a cast figure commissioned by the artist to make his face and his hands. The inside of the sculpture is more of a stick figure, this kind of bare figure, human figure, wearing blue jeans, suspenders, and then you're seeing the back of a shirt, white shirt, that has different pieces of the globe on it. And the idea of bad behavior and what might make an artist be a figure that we think of in a critical light, or one where we have to think about the personal versus the creative output. Or an artist, someone who's larger than life, from which we seek inspiration, but how do we actually understand what that figure means to us? That's what this piece inspires in me when I see it. This kind of real ambiguity of where's the line and why is that line so interesting? I mean, this is actually the opposite of the KOS piece in a work that's so much about warmth and creativity. This one is about a little bit about uncomfortable sensation, which to me is doubly present because of these maps and the globe. And to think of what the idea of an interconnected globe was at that time. And in a way, it was so much about consumption, right? And about money and about markets. It's true, we're seeing some comments, some great comments in the chat. We're being asked to consider history not as the flow of time, but as an arrangement of space, that in the corner as a timeout. That is so true. The personal timeout, but what does it mean to also be out of time in a larger sense? The personal is political. That's you know, kind of an essential phrase for us to think about, but what does it mean when it's mapped onto the artist in ways that are not so clearly defined? So, and some kind of monument or anti-monument for us to think about.
Well, especially in light of the title of the room is After the Wall, and we think about what the Berlin Wall did. It separated two countries, it separated people, it separated families, and the taking down of the wall as a collective act of not destruction, but as one of our learners has said, it was also a kind of deconstruction of these barriers. But simultaneously, as you have said, Sophie, so well, is that that moment in time also engendered and catalyzed profound transformations across the planet in terms of the circulation of people, the circulation of economies, invisible and not, as it were. And that transformation was as much a government action as it was one in which suddenly, as you said, like the market suddenly exploded in places that had formerly been more restricted, if not completely restricted, from the quote unquote West. I found this work to be very off-putting. It's very uncomfortable to encounter it. I don't know if it's because the figure is as if there is a human in the corner. I don't know if it is related to my memories of standing in the corner. I was a very naughty student in elementary school.
I have a hard time believing that.
And I stood in the corner many times. But it's also the fact that the figure has the arms behind it. So you encounter the back of a human, but the hands are held in each other behind, right? So they could be in a kind of giving hands, like they're being held out, but in reverse. But they also, to me, spoke almost like they were in handcuffs, even though those aren't present, right? There's a constraint here that I didn't expect to feel when I saw it.
Yeah, or a kind of penance, right? A kind of
Ooh, yeah.
yeah. And actually, I'm wondering if we could go back to the very first slide of the installation views, because there had been a question about the Kiki Smith work, which just might be a nice segue into one of the pre-submitted questions that was about sculpture.
Mm.
Just one more. Thanks so much, Zach. Or two more, sorry. There we go.
Yeah.
So I believe that we had linked out a reference to this work in the chat, but just to say two words about it. It's a work, untitled work by Kiki Smith from the 1980s that I believe is a dozen silver-plated glass bottles, glass vessels, kind of, I believe, industrially made and available, that are coated in silver and inscribe each of them with the name of a bodily fluid, right? Be it blood, saliva, sweat, sperm, etc. And Kiki Smith describes the, you talked about childhood, also a kind of upbringing and the impact of a Catholic upbringing or Christian upbringing on the creation of this work as one that has a kind of sacramental or a kind of sacred and solemn atmosphere around it. And somehow, I don't know what's wrong with me this morning, but I'm thinking like that and Kippenberger together, it feels like extremely fraught. You know, again, like what are the kind of symbols? What is the sacred? What are the symbols?
And how is in many cases, how is religion and or spirituality redefined through these larger global, if not, worldly actions, right? So if we began today's conversation around the body politic, what about the body religious in this case? And to me, this Kiki Smith work has these connotations of, for me at least, of going into a chapel in Naples or in Rome, or where you start to see the fragments of saints or the fragments of, of, of figures, religious figures, we might not know who they are, but that notion of that little bit of the body, that little fragment of the body speaking to a much larger whole. And it's what I find between this room and the subsequent rooms is that when we think of the individual, the piece, that then speaks for so much else, to me, that also drives a discussion of course, the contemporary, but of art and art in general. Speak, if it doesn't speak, right? If we can't imagine that there is a kind of larger dialogue in play, then we have to question then what is it? What is being spoken about, and how is it being spoken about?
That's so true. And I would be remiss not to mention again I think, I mean, the parallels that can be made, or just the link that can be drawn between our current pandemic and the real suffering and pain that we're dealing with socially, globally, with this moment in the 1980s, and thinking about the AIDS crisis, which this work I think is also very much in relation to, and that opens up, I think, links to works we have again in the kind of agency module in the course about who is remembered, who is mourned, how do we mourn, how do we honor. That's something that the Louise Hemmenser work does, Uruguayan work of remembering those who have been, naming those who have been lost, right, and disappeared and killed. But I have, even just a very contemporary example that's not one of art, but one of culture. I remember when the death toll in the United States passed 100,000, the New York Times printed I think 1,000 of those names with one-line obituaries about humanizing and putting a face and a story to these lives lost. And I remember in the kind of HIV AIDS activist artist communities that I'm attuned to and listen to, folks sharing that when 100,000 people had died of AIDS related complications, that it was one paragraph, right, in the New York Times in 1990 or whatever year it might be. So I think that, I hope what we do with this course, it's the art and culture and cinema and architecture and all the things that we love and care about matter as they are installed in our exhibitions, but they only really matter, I think, if they can help us think through some of these questions. Who gets to be remembered? How do we mourn? So, I think that, that Kiki Smith work maybe brings together some of these ideas.
Absolutely. We are all very fortunate to be able to be where we are right now in the face of it all. I think in the United States, was it yesterday or 2 days ago that we crossed 250,000 deaths? It's unfathomable. This has been a horrific year, and it no doubt takes its toll on each of us, and it takes its toll on the world. And so I feel like these office hours are not only therapeutic for me, but I think provide a bit of remove from what's happening outside, a little bit, hopefully.
Yeah. Grace poses a very beautiful question, which maybe we should bring to the discussion forums.
Yeah, let's do it.
What would a COVID-19 monument look like? That's a powerful question. Also seeing Adrian chime in about Doris Salcedo's work, public mourning and remembrance. So much of there's so many examples of thinking of the individual body that's being remembered or being represented. I'm thinking of Robert Gober's really kind of sinister but also moving wax body parts that hint at something that is present but also unwell, you know, uncanny, right?
Right.
These protrusions. But then thinking also of works like Salcedo's that maybe is more about actually an infrastructure, right? An infrastructure of absence.
Mm.
So
I think you're right. It's what comes to mind too. I hate to interrupt. Is if there, I'm sure there will be at some point in the future a memorial to maybe even this year, or to those lost in the pandemic. Um, I think of the AIDS quilt. I've seen the AIDS quilt in various iterations around the country during the 80s. My parents even took me to see it. They said it was an important thing to witness. And that the kind of the collective action to remember and the collective action to see is what a museum allows for. It creates that space in which to see. And speaking of COVID-19 memorials, there are many of them sprouting up in different parts of the country. I've seen photographs of a number where just small flags are planted, small white flags, not American flags, but white flags are planted in the ground, and you start to see the landscape change because of these flags. So that's one kind of, say, temporary way of seeing. And like you said, Sophie, that front page Times message, article, I don't know what to even call it, memorial, was profound. And I think in a way I keep saying this to many people, is like what we're a part of, what we're implicated in, is understanding that these systems and these structures that have for so long kind of kept us relatively together are also incredibly precarious. And that they too are created by people, and therefore the people are also precarious, the individuals, their voices, the communities, and so forth. So we're witness to precarity at a phenomenal global scale now, in a very difficult moment in time.
it's very true. It's so true. Well, I don't know if you, you know, Sean, I grew up in outside of Paris, Greek father, Belgian mother. So, and born in Washington, D.C., actually at the height of the AIDS crisis. So kind of a mix, right? Lots of things to think about. But when I was in high school, every year the high school students went to the Normandy beaches and visited the cemeteries of all the soldiers lost. And I think that there's such a physical, I mean, like as far as the eye can see, physical, architectural, spatial place to remember and to mourn. And to think of what that looks like in a very interconnected and ephemeral and contingent contemporary world is really hard to think about. But we have, Shauna, we had one pre-submitted question about sculpture, and I
Yes, let's go for it.
yeah, I mean, the folks here want to know about sculpture, so you know, let's get serious here. So
we're going to try to steer away from mourning and
yes. but this shows you actually what I think what conversations are. I mean, amongst colleagues, friends, families, certainly in my world, perhaps yours too, that the borders of what your work is and what the world around it is blurry, and I think it should be actually. So anyway, Maria asked a question I like very, very much, which is, what would you think is the main answer to the following question? Can you point out the differences between modern sculpture, for instance, Brancusi, versus contemporary sculpture? And the example there given was Anish Kapoor. In some ways, the Kiki Smith work that we have on screen is a good part of the response. And we've already mentioned the use of kind of pre-existing and industrial found materials. But just to back up, how would we conceptualize this difference? I would personally start with, if we can describe a modernist sculpture as one that has an inherent formal and maybe idealized perspective or goal, which is about entering into a more predetermined, still being upended, but a more predetermined set of formal manifestations. So whether that's balance or composition or fluidity, if you think of a Brancusi sculpture that's looking for the kind of harmony of composition, and equally to be about material and working primarily with more classical materials, be those marble or castings of different kinds, metal, things that are made to last and things that are made to endure. Mm. Think about contemporary sculpture, which is such an infinitely malleable and surprising field. When learning very often from my colleagues who work in that department, I would say the turn to found material and non-art material is probably the biggest transition. And actually you see that transition very much in the decades that we're looking at in this screen. So after kind of post-war use of, let's see, you first had a kind of transformation of how fine art materials were used. So we can look at perhaps Donald Judd as somebody whose retrospective is now on view as having a radically new perspective, using perhaps industrial materials, but still kind of in a register of kind of structures and metal on the ground, right? I'm a film person, I'll be very, very, very crude, metal on the ground, right? That's what we're dealing with, perhaps. In other cases, more ephemeral things like Felt, right, by Robert Morris. But I like to think about maybe an artist like Rachel Harrison, who's going to be linked to in a moment, with a work actually named Alexander the Great, which is a great way to think of contemporary interventions into classical ideas. As an artist and as a practice that's using completely a mix of materials that are found, that are ephemeral, that are made to be temporary, whether it's, in the case of this work, which I'm just going to open up. Well, we have a link now that's in the chat. Let's see here. Sorry, I'm just trying to see an image of it so I can describe it a little bit for you. Forgive me. So it's assemblage work that's mixing high and low materials, things like chicken wire and wastebasket, things like sunglasses, jewelry, really just kind of anything that might be found, Halloween mask, and that being put together as an object that is still meant to be permanent and meant to hold space. That I think is really a good way to think about what constitutes a contemporary kind of sculptural practice.
I think I like this idea of holding space, right? Is that on one hand, Brancusi sculpture it's containing within its form and its formal qualities and its material properties a meaning that is not necessarily being addressed to you, but presented to you as a viewer, and you can walk around it, you can encounter it in different ways. And the formal notions or connotations are yours and yours alone. In a way, the difference would be, even with someone like Kapoor uses very specific kinds of materials. Of course, he's perhaps famous for copywriting the darkest black ever invented, Vanta black. He uses mirrored metal forms and very, very expensive metals quite often to create concave and convex surfaces that you see the world around you in different ways. That kind of, those formal qualities though hold space in a maybe in a more optic way, in a less in a physical way. Although his sculpture in Chicago in Millennium Park that kind of retakes the city and how you see yourself in the city is a difference. With Harrison, many people recognize those objects, right? That you see a plastic chair, you understand it's a plastic chair, or you see a necklace, it is a necklace. But the assembly and the placement and the thinking behind the relationships that she's creating in her sculptures becomes the thing or the way into the work itself. So in a way, that holding space can be both external to the viewer, in as much as it can be internal in the ways in which we put together meanings and then kind of projected outward. I believe another question has come in, and I'm also very cognizant of the time, Sophie. Um, it's from Celine. When technology or digital media is introduced to contemporary installations, such as the screens that you see in this room that we're looking at now by Theo Echetu, would this fall into a sculpture category? And as technology becomes a material, or at least a very real thing, quote unquote, in our life, how does sculpture change?
So that's such a good question, and actually one that I think, yeah, it's a beautiful question, and I've linked out to a really important exhibition that considered these questions called Before Projection Video Sculpture, 1974-1995. Moving image, whether it is film or video, things that were meant to be seen on television or on installed on monitors in an art gallery context. That spatial manifestation of the moving image changed so much with what we know to be as large-scale digital projection, that maybe is the way we're used to encountering moving image work in a gallery. But before that became kind of standardized, both through the technology of projectors and frankly, the cavernous spaces of contemporary museums, that negotiation was a lot more multifaceted. So I really encourage you to check out that exhibition to think exactly of that question of how the architecture of technology and the sculptural qualities of video monitors and video technology was taken on by artists in a very, very dynamic way. That's actually one of my favorite questions that we've ever gotten. Thank you so much.
And just for a brief second before we have to go, I would say too that the previous question and that question also relates to scales of body, scales of watching, of seeing, scales that are encapsulated in a cathode ray tube to make a television and a monitor, in as much as today the scale like we're seeing globally with a Zoom meeting discussion like we've had as well. So
yeah, and the question of where sculpture ends and installation begins is again really a very kind of profound question, which
maybe we should talk about at our next office hours.
I think we could, but I would just say it has to do the ingredients that go into that answer are about, again, space of the studio, space of display, and also criticism, like how, like the conversations that artists and viewers and critics were all having, like when did you open up and be able to approach things in ways that weren't about objects, but maybe more about interventions. So I really thank you for that question, and maybe we could think about it actually, more in depth in the next one.
I think it's about ephemerality and time. It's about bodies in space. It's the scale and also value. And so I value not only as an economic precept, but value is how we understand each other. And that art becomes a reflection of these values and other values and our intersection with them.
So it just to bring this this session to a close, I'd like to thank you all for spending the hour with us and for your really thoughtful questions. This program will be shared in the course modules. A recording of it will be able to be accessed. And there are also discussion forums there to keep all these conversations going, including one called the Curator's Corner, where you're always welcome to ask us questions about anything, about artwork, about our work at the museum, anything at all. And I believe that in closing, we might want to allow you all to unmute yourselves, and we can just collectively bid each other farewell from every corner of the world. So
Literally.
if you'd like to, please unmute yourself.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you very much.
It's lovely to have you. And we will post the next date for our office hours very soon.